Okay, welcome to the fifth module, objectives, benchmarks, and sampling. Oh my. So we're now kind of on the last stretch of this data series. And today what I want to really speak about is kind of putting some of the themes together and really thinking about kind of the construction of IEP goals and objectives, but objectives in particular and how objectives are tied to benchmarks and how that's going to relate to how we think about sampling of evidence that will speak to achieving the growth information that's in an objective and how it's tied to particular targets, which are those benchmarks, with deadlines and dates and things that can affect how we think about those target values. Okay, so let's dig in here. So the first thing I want to speak to is a kind of a distinction which I think often can get blurred when we're thinking about the IEP, what goes in the IEP proper as a document, and then what in some states may not be included in the IEP per se, but ought to be included in terms of how you're going to go about collecting data that speaks to the information that's spelled out in the IEP. In some states, those methodological descriptions are in the IEP proper. But the typical idea is that what's described, let's say, in an objective is often a very lean description of what you're actually going to do when it comes to collecting evidence that speaks to the academic skills or the physical skills or the conceptual skills or the social emotional ones that you're targeting. Okay, so what I want to begin with today is just trying to find that balance so that we have sufficient information to describe what is set out for a child within the objectives and benchmarks, and then what staff are going to have to do to collect evidence to support that work. So, in a typical type of document, you've got, whether it's digital or on, typed up somewhere in some document, is that you've got information on, when the meetings are going to occur, start dates and end dates, what's the current kind of, performance level of a student, and then what specifically is going to be achieved with a given objective. Okay, so let's take an example like this. Sarah will X, what will Sarah do with no more than one prompt? Okay, so that's some kind of support in X out of Y opportunities, again, which is that benchmark, and then the timeline by the end of the IEP period. Okay, so that's kind of a typical lean description of an objective with sort of target benchmark. But now, if I were to hand something like that to staff and say, Sarah will walk a certain distance, or Sarah will read, some number of words per minute with no more than one prompt in, 4 out of 5 opportunities, there's lots of things that are left unclear in terms of what staff are actually doing. So here's where the methodological richness of the information must be spelled out. Okay, so first of all, of course, we have to define X, right? What's the thing that Sarah is going to do, right? What's the target there? We're going to have to describe the types of prompts, right? How are they delivered? When are they delivered? For example, if it's a hierarchy of prompts from, let's say visual or gestural to verbal to partial physical to physical, right? Then we describe, so how is that given? Am I facing the child, right? Where am I grabbing the child? How long am I waiting before I give the next level of prompting in the hierarchy? Those are all methodological details that are not spelled out in the objective, but certainly need to be spelled out methodologically to develop consistency across staff. Okay, what's an opportunity, right? So is that every time I give the child a chance to read, if it's a reading kind of objective, in terms of walking, Sarah will walk a certain distance, right? What's the opportunity? Anywhere she walks in the school, over a certain kind of terrain, a certain distance, okay? Fourth, how are the Y opportunities distributed over the course of the IEP evaluation period? So if I say, she will read 45 words per minute, with no more than one prompt or redirection, let's say, in 4 out of 5 opportunities. And let's say the IEP period, let's say we're talking, for a year, right? Well, what's the distribution of time over which those 5 opportunities will be sampled? And then in addition, what's the interval of time between opportunities? Okay? Those can have quite dramatic effects on the assessment per se and on the child's ability to showcase what's going on. Okay? So I hope what's become clear here, just as the initial opening to this discussion today, is that what goes into the IEP document per se within, let's say, an objective or even a goal is going to be a far cry from the kinds of methodological details that one needs to basically collect data that's relevant to the goal or objective. Okay, so let me give you a way of thinking about the relationship between the elements that go into an IEP objective. And I'm going to use the acronym OBSI. O stands for operationalization, and that's to operationalize the key terms and the key idea within the IEP objective. Okay, so how are you defining things? So if they're walking, what do you mean by walking? If they're reading, what kind of reading? Is it timed, not timed, and so forth. Second, B stands for the benchmark, right? So what is the target sort of statistic that we're looking for with respect to achieving some kind of progress, right? And that benchmark, of course, will be related to sort of current performance levels, right, or baselines, right? So what do we know about the child's competencies right now or skills, right? And what do we believe they can achieve in terms of progress by some date? That's the benchmark. Third, what kind of scale of measurement are we going to be using when it comes to the behavior or the performance or the skill the child's demonstrating? Is it a percentage? Is it a count? Is it a frequency? Is it a rate? Is it a categorical scale, let's say, that links to the kind of support from, visual prompt, verbal prompt, partial physical, full physical, right? So those would be categorical scales. What is our scale of measurement that's going to be applied to collect the data? And then lastly, E for evaluation. What are the methods that we're using to evaluate the child during the objective that's been spelled out with the benchmark and with the scale? Okay? So OBSI stands for operationalize, benchmark, scales, and evaluate. The key piece of this, which I hope will become clearer as we move on in today's kind of module, is that these are heavily interrelated. What I mean by that is that, let's say you start out and you operationalize what's in the objective, then you tie it to a benchmark, right, which is the statistic that you're going to be using, right? So we start here and we operationalize, then we give it the benchmark, right? Then we determine what kind of scale of measurement we're going to use, and then we develop our methodology. What will become clear as we go on today is that often, once we've defined it and come up with our benchmark, we may think, well, this is the scale of measurement I've been thinking about, but is that really feasible given the methods that I know either can or can't be applied to this situation? So just to give a simple example, let's say that we are looking at a child's ability to kind of stay seated, right? This is a child who may gets up a lot, moving around, and we really want the child to stay seated during lessons. So we start out by saying, we collect some baseline and we say, typically this child gets out of his seat, 10 times in a lesson. And what we're looking for his progress is to get it down to 5, okay? An average of 5 per day, let's say, or 5 per lesson. If a child's, kind of maximum time getting out of his seat is, let's say, 10, we might think, well, a count's reasonable. We're going to count every time he does it, and we'll use that as our scale of measurement. It's a count. But if we're talking about a behavior which might happen, let's say, hundreds of times in a day, it may just not be feasible to do a count for this objective. And so we may have to modify both the scale of measurement and our methodology and our benchmark to accommodate what kind of assessment is possible given the constraints of, let's say, the school or the classroom. Okay? So the key idea here, which we're going to continue to delve into in detail over the course of this module, is that when we develop these components, the operationalization, the benchmark, the scale of measurement, and the evaluation methodology, they relate to each other in important ways, and when we tweak one, we may be forced to tweak the others. Okay, so let's sort of just dig in now to detail and with a specific example. Okay, so let's imagine the following objective. Jim will independently stand up from a seated position and then walk for 30 seconds on 7 out of 8 observed opportunities by the end of the IEP period. Okay. So we've got some key words here, right? And I'm flagging them here in red. So the key words are, right, will independently stand up from a seated position, walk for 30 seconds, and 7 out of 8 observed opportunities. Okay, so seated position, right? This has to be, again, defined methodologically. It has to be operationalized. Again, we don't owe that in the IEP document specifically, right? You don't have to spell this out here because we're trying to keep the document itself fairly lean. But methodologically, if I'm working with one or more staff or even just myself, I need to be clear what counts as seated, right? Butt on the ground and or in a chair and or in a couch, on a beanbag, right? Let's say there's lots of places where Jim could be seated, right? Am I counting anything where his butt is on the ground and his feet are planted on the ground? He has to get up from that. Or am I more flexible? Or am I more narrow, saying, no, only when he's on the ground? Okay, so I'm going to define, operationalize the O of OBSI, right? The seated position. What I'm also going to do, right, is I'm going to be clear on my scale, right? So he's walking, right? So that's what's happening from seated position. He gets up and he walks, and the scale is for 30 seconds. So I'm doing two things here, okay? And this is where we already have one potential problem with this objective, right? We actually have two separate skills. He's getting up, which is one piece of information, and then he's walking for a duration of time, 30 seconds, right? And he's also doing it independently, right? I'm not holding him, I'm not prompting him, right? He's doing all this independently. So the problem is I've got sort of two measures. He stands up successfully and then he walks for 30 seconds. So I'm timing it and he's going to get up. Okay. The 7 out of 8 opportunities, of course, is that benchmark piece. Okay. And here, methodologically, I owe some information on, well, over what time span are those opportunities occurring, right? Is it over the course of, let's say, a month, where maybe once a week or twice a week, I try to get 2 observations in of Jim standing up from a seated position and then walking for 30 seconds. Okay, and I'm going to count it as achieved the benchmark insofar as in at least 7 of those opportunities, he gets up independently and he walks for at least 30 seconds. If he does that, that's the 7 out of 8. Methodologically, right, there's much to be described here that I've left out. Okay, so what's the terrain over which he's walking? What if he walks, stops, walks again, stops, and walks again? So it's not continuous, right? I need to specify my method is it's 30 seconds of continuous walking, right? And if he pauses for any reason, I count that as not as having achieved that target objective, right? So in the 7 out of 8, if he gets up, he walks for 10 seconds, he stops for 20, he walks for another 20 seconds, he walks cumulatively for 30 seconds, but it's broken up. That does not count as having achieved on that opportunity the conditions I set out. Okay, let's now take another example just to kind of show some of the variability in these issues. Okay, so here's one which is longer and it's spelled out a little more specifically. During a 30-minute academic activity, in parentheses, right, giving examples, math, reading, writing, art, music, etc., Braden will participate in the lesson, meaning he'll complete his work, participate in academic lessons, and so forth, for 5 minutes during the first progress period, 10 minutes during the second progress period, 15 minutes during the third progress period, and 20 minutes during the fourth and final progress period. Okay, a lot going on here. The pieces I want to flag so that we can think about ways in which we could revise this is, okay, we've got a 30-minute academic activity. It entails these kinds of activities, right? We've got a term here called participation, which is in some ways defined here, completing his work and participating, okay? And we've got an entire set of benchmarks. We've got some challenges here, okay? And these challenges need to be really fleshed out if we're going to have an IEP objective that can be coherently and clearly measured, okay? So first of all, we've got a 30-minute activity, okay? So what happens, for example, on a given day if it doesn't last 30 minutes, okay? We can't be measuring pure duration, in part because 5 minutes out of a 30-minute activity would be very different than 5 minutes out of a 20-minute activity. Given the fact that certain lessons might have to be kind of aborted or stopped for lots of reasons, right? There are maybe challenges within the school. There's a fire drill, right? There needs to be a change because maybe some related service person's coming in, has to do something now rather than later. The kids are bored. They're not willing to kind of participate. So this would be a case where we want to be clear that it might be better off to actually think about this as a percentage of time than a pure duration, and therefore our scale of measurement might change. Okay. Another piece which is left unspecified is whether or not the participation piece is with or without support. So is this Braden participating during academic activities with no support, meaning independently, or is he being potentially prompted or redirected back to the activity? If so, we need to specify within our objective that there is some level of support that is required for the particular benchmark that we're setting. Okay. Another piece of this is this time involved in being engaged with this lesson? Let's say, for example, in participating. Is participation just doing something, right? Or is this kind of the sustainability or the grit, right, of that child being able to sustain participation? For example, I have an activity. Let's say it lasts 30 minutes, okay? And during that time, let's just say it's math. I give a worksheet. If the child, Braden in this case, right, works on one problem, stops, says, can I take a break, go get some water, comes back, does another 5 minutes, takes another break, puts his head down for 10 minutes, and again, that would not be a continuous period of time, even though in the end, he might work for 15 minutes. Okay, so one is just kind of cumulative time, or percentage. The other one is how long can he sustain effort before getting distracted or giving up or whatever it is. Okay, so here it's about being clear about what we're thinking about with respect to participation. Is it just cumulative amount of time, or is it something like grittiness or effort, right, that he puts into what's going on? Okay, so before I go back to this, just so to finish this off then, we want to spell out again, you know, is it percentage of time? Is it grit? Is it with support? Is it not? We also want to be clearer about what counts as participation. In this case, in parentheses, it says completing his work. Now, completing work is one thing, right? If I give you a worksheet, I may not complete it, but I fully participated in the sense that I've been working on it for sustained time, right? So completing work seems like a much higher bar and perhaps something different, like completion of tasks, than simply participation. Secondly, we want to be careful of not defining a term by using the same word. So what does participation look like, right, for Braden? Well, participation might be actively working on a worksheet. If it's a conversation, it's engaging in questions and answers, right? It's paying attention, whole body listening. So we want to define participation methodologically so that it's clearly observed in terms of behavior. Okay, another example, and this is where scale of measurement will become very clear. Let's say the objective is Sam will reduce the frequency of commenting on other peers and argue with staff to no more than 5 per day for 10 consecutive days by the end of the IEP period. Okay, so here we have clearly a social emotional type of objective. Okay, it's fairly lean in that it describes the behavior we're looking at. It describes a benchmark, all right, of no more than 5 per day. Okay, so we can allow anywhere from 0 to 5, right, which will admit it. And we're looking for 10 consecutive days by the end of the IEP period. Okay, so the first thing is, for our scale of measurement, we've labeled this as a frequency. Okay, so the frequency of commenting on other peers and arguing with staff. Now, if the child is doing, let's say in a school day of 6 hours, 10, 15 comments on other peers and arguing, maybe we're okay with a frequency count. But if this child is perpetually commenting others, every time somebody opens their mouth, they're like, hey, why'd you say that? Or don't do that, or that was stupid, or whatever they're saying, right? Appropriate, inappropriate. That count could get up into the hundreds. And that would be physically impossible for any teacher or paraprofessional to be tracking that in addition to all the other things that are going on in the classroom. Okay? So a frequency count must take into account the feasibility of counting given all the other tasks that are going on in the classroom. And what that entails basically is there are many other things for teachers and paraprofessionals to do in a classroom other than tracking data. And that's not only for that one child, but for all the children in the classroom. Okay? And when that occurs, one possibility is to think about a different type of scale of measurement, and that's a categorical scale. Right? So what we might want to do is say, okay, we'll have one category which is never commenting on other peers and arguing staff in a given observation period. Rarely, defined as 1 to 3, some 5 to 7, and often 8 or more. So once it gets beyond 8, we're going to include that as an often category, and we're done because we simply don't have time to do more than that. Okay? Another possibility is to focus much more specifically on a certain kind of period of time where you can count. Okay? So we can say each day I'll pick either a different activity or a different time block, and I'll do my counts in that period. Okay, so now you're reducing the frequency count to a shorter period of time, which may be more feasible. Okay, and as long as those windows for taking the count are consistent, then we can compare counts across days or times. Okay, so the key point here is the scale of measurement has to be calibrated to what's feasible, which are your methodologies. And this goes back to that earlier comment that the definition or the operationalization, the benchmark, the scale, and the evaluation all work together and have to be tweaked so that they can work together. A second piece that I want to focus on here that is related to the scale of measurement is that here we've got an objective which is measuring two different things or two skills. One is Sam's ability to reduce the frequency of commenting on other peers, but a very different kind of skill is that he argues with staff, right? He says, why do I have to do this, right? Why do I have to wait in line? Why can't I comment on my peers, right? So those are two different things, and if we're just getting a count, we are mixing two different skills and can't tell. For example, if I enter into my spreadsheet or into my database that today Sam, in combination, had 23 comments on other peers and argument staff, and I don't differentiate between those, it may be that he had 22 of commenting on peers and 1 argument staff, and I can't tell the difference because they've been merged. So well-written objectives that can be assessed with evidence should have 1 skill per objective. Another piece of this, which links to the relationship between the scale of measurement and the benchmark, is that we have labeled it as 10 consecutive days. What about weekends? So I get Monday through Friday, and then I've got a break of 2 days. That's clearly not consecutive. They're consecutive school days. But when I go from Friday to Monday, that's very different than going from Thursday to Friday, where Friday is clearly only 1 day different from Thursday. Okay? So if that's the case, things may be happening on weekends, or with absences, or with breaks, or with half days that throws off that consecutive piece. And therefore, if that's a reality, then basically saying that you're going for 10 consecutive days may just not be feasible. That benchmark may never be achievable because of things like absences and half days and so forth. Okay? So we want to set up those benchmarks so that they're achievable, and that requires taking into account both school days and the possibility of breaks, absences, and so forth. What I want to turn to now is beginning to turn the discussion so far into kind of a dissection of the objective that maybe gives a bit of a template for how to organize it when you're writing an actual objective so that it takes into account some of the issues we've mentioned so far. One option is one that was recently summarized in a paper in Teaching for Exceptional Children by Grant et al. That builds on earlier work that suggests that you have kind of an ABCD approach along with T+, which is timeline. In other words, A is who's the audience, and that would be an example of Zeke will. Okay. B is the behavior. What will Zeke do? Zeke will read aloud. C, context. Zeke will read aloud when given selection from 3rd grade reading textbook and 1 minute to read. So that's kind of the context and a bit of the methodology, right? D, degree, which is basically the benchmark in part, which is number of correct words to 84 words per minute. And then T plus is the timeline, right? Over what period of time? In 36 weeks, that's what Zeke will achieve, okay? So that's a kind of a nice structure, right? So audience clearly is the student, right? Behavior is what they will do, right? Read aloud in this case. Context is kind of the conditions under which it will occur. Degree, D, and T, timeline, is basically the benchmark, right? What's the score you're looking for and over what time course? Okay. I personally like a slightly different kind of template, which I think is a little bit more clear in terms of what you need to do. And that is basically in terms of 5 questions. Who's doing something, right? What are they doing? How are they doing it? With what kind of accuracy or measurement, right? And by when, okay? So these are a bunch of W questions with the exception of the H, right? But 4 W questions and 1 H question, right? So who did it? What did they do? How do they do it? With what kind of accuracy or competency? And by when? Okay, let me flesh that out for you with some examples. So let's look at an objective which is about following directions. So who, right? Jenna's the student, okay? What are they going to do? They will follow directions from staff within 30 seconds with positive attitude, meaning there's no facial expressions or kind of, grumps or humps or sounds, okay? So they're following directions. You want them to do it quickly, meaning within 30 seconds, and with a positive attitude. How? Okay? With no more than 1 verbal or gestural prompts, meaning that you're going to potentially provide support, but when given a direction, with no more than one either verbal or gestural prompt, they will follow directions within 30 seconds. With what kind of accuracy or competency? On 9 out of 10 opportunities, only one per day, spread out over a 2-week period. Okay, so that's our target, 9 out of 10 opportunities. So we're looking for consistency here. One per day, one opportunity per day, and spread out over a 2-week period. When? By the end of the IEP reporting period. Okay, so who is doing it? What are they doing it? How are they doing it? Which is kind of that support piece. With what kind of competency or accuracy, and by when, which gives you the combination of the benchmark statistic and the benchmark time frame. I want to now come back to a topic we've talked about a few times in the data modules, and that is that no benchmark can be set up without solid baseline information. And to kind of come back to a theme and a topic we talked about before, if we're looking at some kind of benchmark and we report only a baseline which has an average, we need to be sensitive to the fact that averages come from multiple samples and that those multiple samples are often attached with some kind of variability, and that variability can be very informative in terms of how we set the benchmark. So again, to repeat that example, we might have a case where the baseline, if the if time is along the kind of x or horizontal axis and the performance measure is the y or vertical axis, this is a child who's varying a bit, right? But fairly consistently over time, we drew an average here, right? The range is maybe not that great, okay? So we might be confident in talking about an average because the variability is not so great. But we can achieve the same average with a child who starts out low and is constantly increasing in performance, so that by the time we end the baseline period, they're actually much better off than they were earlier on. Of course, the opposite is possible, right? They start off well, and for some reason, right, there's a regression, right? They get worse over time. So we're ending up in a worse position than when we started, but the average would hit right here about in the middle. And then lastly, we might have a student who's ranging all over the place, right? Highs and lows, showing that clearly they can do very, very well, assuming that high is associated with doing well and low is doing not so well, right? They can do very poorly here and here, and they can do very well here and here. So in each of these cases, we've got kind of a different type of performance measure, even though the average would be very similar across these. Okay, so it's very important that we have not only good baseline information, but we understand the potential causes of variability that underlie that baseline so that we can set appropriate benchmarks going forward. And that would be true whether we're talking about academic goals in math or ELA or whatever it is, or kind of functional IEP objectives or goals like brushing our teeth or making a bed or cleaning a table, or social emotional ones that may have to do with engagement or non-compliance or anything like that in the social emotional domain. So the issue of solid baselines is critical irrespective of the type of IEP that we're talking about. So let's now talk about benchmarks as basically growth targets, right? So we are trying to set up fairly aggressive, right, benchmarks, things that would be, achievable, but important if we achieve them. Okay, we don't want to set the bar so low that of course we're going to achieve it all the time, but the child's not really showing much impressive growth, right? So we want to show good growth so that child is increasing access to the curriculum, is increasingly able to maintain self-regulation and grow those executive functions, make good decisions, and fully capture what a school has to offer, right? Okay. So one question is, well, what kind of growth are we looking for? Is it simply a performance measure about, some kind of academic or social emotional skill? Or is it doing something with less support, let's say something where the child is trying to achieve greater independence? Or is it both, right? Do we want a growth measure that the benchmark is both one having to do with performance, let's say words per minute, or certain kinds of, order of operations in math, or non-compliance in the social emotional area, but we also want that to be increasingly independent, right? With fading support. Okay, so what kind of growth is the question for the benchmark? Okay, and here, what I often encourage people is to consider benchmarks that have to do with both performance and level of support. Because ideally, we are either trying to enhance the level of support to improve performance, or we are trying to both improve performance while ultimately maybe fading support to achieve greater independence. Second, what are we trying to measure? Is it accuracy? Is it variability, reducing variability perhaps? Is it consistency? Okay, so in benchmarks, what is that target kind of statistic that we're looking for, right? In some cases, we want, a percentage accuracy. In some cases, we want to reduce the variability, right? A child who's highly variable in their performance, we're trying to reduce that and obtain greater consistency. In some cases, it's reducing the magnitude of behaviors. For a child who might be self-injuring, right? We have days where it's down to nothing, right? No self-injuries at all. And in some cases, it's up to in the hundreds, right? Very severe, very serious, right? And there, what we might try and do is to reduce those maximum situations, right? What's causing those big days where it's very, very bad for the child, very, very difficult for staff, obviously, as well? How can we help reduce the magnitude of that variability? A third issue is how much growth by when, right? So here we're in a space where we're not only trying to figure out kind of the statistic, right? So accuracy, variability, consistency, performance or support, but by what date? So how much time do we have to achieve that growth target, okay? And that's important because that's going to relate to our methodology. How often do we have an opportunity to teach the things that we're working on? How often do we have an opportunity to assess what's going on? So we need to plan out where we are with our current baseline, where we hope to be by a certain date, so we can accurately assess how much growth is possible given whatever limitations and facilities and supports we have within the school environment. Fourth is a measure which comes back to our scale but links directly to the benchmark. And that has to do with what I'll refer to as the granularity of the measure. Right? So let me build on an example that I used before. If we are counting the frequency at which a child, let's say, comments on peers, something that might happen many, many, many times in a given day, right? There, our granularity, if our observations are possible and accurate, can be very, very fine-grained, right? Some days it's 24, some days it's 116, right? So we've got very fine-grained measurement there. But if we are not able to do an actual count, and we're forced into a categorical scale, then our granularity changes, right? Let's remember the example I gave. Never, no comments on peers. Rarely, let's say 1 to 3, some 4 to 6, and often 7 or more. Notice what happens. I can distinguish between never, rarely, some, and often, but when I'm in the often space of 7 or more, if 7 and more can be 80, then of course I've got very poor granularity, right? I can't distinguish between often, that is 8 comments on peers, and 80. Okay, so we want to be careful about the granularity of our measure because that will relate to what we are doing with our benchmark, right? So if I say I want the average number of comments to peers to be down by 50%, okay, if I've got a count, I can do that very accurately, right? If I've got a categorical scale, it's much more difficult because of the range of numbers that happen in that often category. Another topic which is important when we set those benchmarks is how many opportunities do we have to assess a child within the period of time, right? So we have here, right, how much growth by when, but that links directly to the number of opportunities we have to assess a child. So if I am a clinician or a therapist or some related services, and I only get to see the child once a week, and this is a child who has high absences, and if I'm looking, let's say, at a 6-month period, I may only have 3 times if there's a lot of absences due to, let's say, medical issues. With some other children, I may have 20 times. So I need to be able to map out what my opportunities are for assessment. Right? And of course, that's related to what my opportunities are for interventions. Right? If I'm working on a child's ability to stand up independently, to move, to self-feed, to self-regulate, right? And I only have a few opportunities within a period to work with that child, my assessments are small, right? And my opportunities for interventions are reduced. Okay, so I need to be able to realistically map out how many opportunities can I actually get by the reporting period so that I can really determine an appropriate benchmark for growth. In addition, and sort of the last piece here, is to think about the factors that can influence performance, right? So if I'm coming up with some measure of growth, that's, let's say, both performance and support, let's say reducing the time spent non-compliant with no more than 1 or 2 verbal or gestural prompts, okay? How often do I have an opportunity to look at that child's non-compliance, and what are the conditions that can affect it, right? Time of day, number of peers nearby, certain peers present, certain staff present, the type of work that the child's been given where they can be compliant or non-compliant. All those may go into both my baseline as well as what I set up as my benchmark. Okay? So here we've got a series of things that can influence the thinking around setting up benchmarks, because ultimately we're looking for effective growth targets, but we have to consider our methodologies, our scales of measurement, and what we're actually able to achieve in terms of sampling. There are, as I've kind of already hinted in some sense, what I'll call different flavors of benchmarks. And that means there just are different ways of spelling out what the benchmark actually is. And I just want to walk through a few of these to give you a sense of how to think about them, which will hopefully guide how you set them up. So a common type of benchmark is a kind of an X out of Y, right? And what X out of Y type benchmarks are really doing is they're spelling out something about the consistency with which we expect students to do something. So if I say, you know, I want a child to read at least 45 words per minute in 3 out of 5 opportunities, or I want them to be able to walk at least 2 feet independently in 4 out of 5 opportunities, right? So what we're saying is we're looking for some consistency in some target behavior or skill, and we need to therefore specify, well, what's the interval between those opportunities for observation over what time span, okay? So that's one kind of benchmark, right? Now, here, how we set that up is going to be greatly influenced by the significance of the consistency piece. And so kind of a common one, right, that's, you know, sort of discussed often, right, is if we've got an objective which has to do with safety, right, or a goal that has to do with safety, let's say on riding a bus or being out in a community, and one of them is cross in front of the bus safely, clearly we want that X out of Y to be 100%, right, in 5 out of 5 opportunities. We don't want errors here, okay? If we're talking about other things, right, like keeping the bus clean, telling the driver if there's a problem, keeping food in the backpack, we might think that there's, you know, maybe more room for variability because it's not as critical that it's perfect. Okay, so what we're looking for is, depending on the measure, what kind of consistency we're looking for. Okay. Now, another way of thinking about this, let me see a little pause here. is thinking about how this is going to work in terms of things like percentages, right? So a very common benchmark is we say so-and-so will have, 80% or more by a certain, kind of date. Okay, so here again, and going back to some of the earlier modules, we need to consider whether we care about kind of the range of variation around that percentage, right? So if we say the average is 80% or more, right, it's possible that sometimes that child gets 100% and sometimes they get 60%, but overall the average is 80%. Well, if we care about that range, we might want to say something about the range of tolerable variation, right? Like we want an average of 80 and no less than 75, okay? And then there's the question of how many samples we have. So we spoke earlier about how small sample sizes can greatly affect percentages. So we want to be thinking about, for example, what is the kind of sample we can get? And is that percentage based on the same number of trials, let's say, for discrete trial type tests or opportunities? So let me give you an example. Let's say we're looking at a child's ability to recognize the letters of the alphabet, both upper and lower case. And in a typical session, we expect to give them a randomized presentation of both upper and lowercase letters for the entire alphabet. So 26 uppercase, 26 lowercase. Okay, so at the end of that, we've got our numbers, right? 52 possible numbers, right? They either got it or they didn't get it. So we have some number out of 52 that gives us our percentage. Okay, fine. However, as will often be the case, we set up for our 52 and the child has a difficult day, they are tired, it's clear we're not going far with this one, and we don't get through our 52. Let's say we get through 10. Well, now we can certainly calculate that percentage, but it's based on a very reduced number of trials and only a fragment of the entire alphabet, upper and lower case. So we may want to calibrate our benchmark and say, I'm only going to include in my analyses a session which has at least 40 or more letters, and if not, I will certainly keep track of that because it's telling me what they got right or wrong. But in terms of my benchmark analysis, I'm only going to run it if I have a reasonably comparable sample of trials or letters for my session. Similarly, if I'm looking at, outbursts, Calvin Hobbes outbursts, then I again want to think about kind of the variation in my samples, right? So if on some days I'm able to observe the child for the entire 6 hours and count up the number of tantrums they have, but on other days it's a half day, well, then the percentage of kind of, let's say, 15-minute intervals where there wasn't a tantrum will be different. And that will have an effect on the percentage. So the point here is that when I think about my benchmarks, we have to think about our sample sizes that go into those statistics so that we can set it up so that they're meaningfully comparable over time. Okay. Another thing that can be often very helpful in a benchmark is to indicate both a performance measure along with a support measure. So, a student will do X, whatever that performance measure is, with no more than Y prompts. So here we're indicating a benchmark which has one statistic assigned to the performance piece and another statistic which has to do with kind of level of support. So, for example, John will show compliance in 80%, right, of trials or observations with no more than one redirection. Okay, so here we've identified both the performance measure, which is compliance, and we've identified with what kind of level of support, in this case, number of prompts. Okay, so we are marrying basically two things, a performance measure and a level or kind or intensity of support. What I believe is desirable in almost all benchmarks when possible, is to identify both a kind of a target statistic and some assessment of variability. For many objectives that are measured within the IEP, consistency of behavior is a critical piece, right? And that one of the things that's being worked on, whether it's social, emotional, or academic, or physical, or speech, or whatever it is that we want the child to be consistently doing something, right? And so we want to think of both some kind of percentage or X out of Y or level of support, but with some sense of kind of the range of tolerable variability that we are willing to shoot for as part of the benchmark. So again, a child who, let's say, is oppositional, right, may show, kind of a range of variability where they show very little, right, opposition on some days and, more on others, and that may continue, right? So there's a whole range of variation, and our target may be, let's say, an average, of level down here with nothing more than this, kind of, size type of opposition over here, right? So we want to rule out variability at this end, right? We're happy, of course, for opposition when they get down and reduce this low end. So if this is a distribution, right? We want to eliminate the right side of the distribution and keep the child within this range of variation. Okay, so that's a way of thinking about the different kind of flavors of benchmarks. So let me sum up for today with some of the key ingredients that will hopefully set you on a path of thinking about the objectives and the benchmarks that go into the IEP. The first piece, which I think is really, really important, is that the details of what goes into the IEP is typically, and the objective specifically, is typically a thin veneer relative to the methodological details that are necessary to carry out the objective, including not only working with a child, but in terms of also assessing the child. The second piece is that if we think of the kind of OBSI acronym, right, the operationalization, the benchmark, the scale of measurement, and the evaluation piece, that as we work on each of these pieces, which we must for the IEP objectives, we'll find that these basically push and pull on each other. Okay, so these are kind of interrelated, and therefore a well worked out IEP objective with all the key details is one that will be kind of maneuvered around until they all kind of work together. As I said, we may come up with a scale of measurement that we think is appropriate, but when we get to the actual evaluation, we realize I just can't count that many occurrences and still teach, science and English and all the other things and do behavioral management for the class. So we modify the scale. When we modify the scale, that affects the benchmark, and it may even affect how we define certain things. Third is a kind of a template for how I think the objective can be set up, and that is who's doing something, what are they doing, how are they doing it, with what kind of accuracy or level of support, or both, and by when. Okay, so those are the ingredients that need to go into the IEP objective and its methodology. Fourth is that benchmarks depend obviously critically on current levels of performance or their baselines. And when we think about those baselines, it's important to think about the variability within them, because that's going to set up basically how we set the benchmark, right? If we are a child who's not varying at all or very little, that's fine. The average can help us set that benchmark. If the child is varying a great deal, we need to understand the causes of that variation, because that will set up instruction and what is achievable in terms of that growth target or benchmark. Okay, so understanding how the baseline behaves is important to setting up the benchmark and what is achievable. And then lastly is that there are different kind of flavors to benchmarks. And what I've been advocating today is that for both goals and objectives, I think it's helpful to set up different sort of statistics for those objectives, right? Both a target value, like an average or a percentage, along with a tolerable range of variation, and often a combination of both performance measures as well as support measures. So I hope this has been useful for you today, and this wraps up the data series, and I hope it's been a useful series for all of you in thinking about what's going on in the data world.